Every morning at 5:30, David pulled into the parking lot behind the police station. His old blue Honda made a rattling sound that echoed off the brick walls, but nobody ever noticed. Nobody ever paid attention to the man in the worn gray uniform who carried a bucket of cleaning supplies and a ring of keys that opened every door in the building. For 3 years, David had been the night janitor at the Central City Police Department. He mopped floors that had seen countless arrests, cleaned windows that looked out onto streets where justice was supposed to live, and emptied trash cans filled with the paperwork of people's worst days. The officers who worked there knew his face, but they didn't really see him. To them, he was just part of the furniture, another piece of equipment that kept the place running. This invisibility suited David just fine. Most people would have found it lonely, being ignored by everyone around them. But David had learned long ago that being invisible could be the most powerful thing in the world. When people don't see you, they forget you're there. And when they forget you're there, they say things they probably shouldn't. The morning routine never changed. David would unlock the side door using his master key and step into the quiet hallways. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that harsh white glow that made even the bravest police officer look tired. His cart squeaked as he pushed it down the corridor, past the empty offices where detectives would soon be drinking coffee and trying to solve crimes that seemed impossible. But David knew something about impossible crimes. He knew more than anyone in that building could imagine. 20 years ago, David had worn a different uniform. 20 years ago, he had carried a badge and a gun instead of a mop and a spray bottle. Detective David Chen had been one of the best investigators in the Detroit Police Department. He had solved murders that other cops had given up on. He had put dangerous people behind bars and helped families find closure when their worlds had been torn apart. That was before everything went wrong. The case that ended his career started like so many others. A young woman had been found dead in an alley, and all the evidence pointed to her boyfriend. It seemed simple enough. The boyfriend had a criminal record. He had been violent before. The physical evidence seemed to match. David's partner and the other detectives were ready to close the case and move on to the next one. But something didn't feel right to David. The more he dug into the details, the more questions he had. Why was the victim's phone missing when everything else had been left behind? Why didn't any of the witnesses remember seeing the boyfriend in the area that night? Why did the forensic evidence seem almost too perfect? David kept investigating even when his supervisors told him to let it go. He followed leads that led him into dark corners of the city, where honest cops weren't supposed to go. He discovered that several officers in his own department were taking money from drug dealers. He found out that evidence had been planted before. He learned that the real killer was someone with connections, someone who could make problems disappear. When David tried to bring this information to his superiors, he was told to stay quiet. When he refused, strange things started happening. His car was vandalized. His house was broken into, though nothing was stolen. His daughter, who was only 12 at the time, started getting strange phone calls at school. The message was clear: back off or face the consequences. David had two choices. He could keep fighting and put his family in danger, or he could walk away and let the corruption continue. In the end, his daughter's safety mattered more than his badge. He resigned from the force and moved his family far away from Detroit. But leaving the police department didn't mean leaving behind his sense of justice. The years that followed were difficult. David worked construction jobs, drove delivery trucks, and did whatever he could to support his family. His wife understood why he had made the choice he did, but she could see how much it hurt him to walk away from the work he loved. His daughter grew up knowing that her father had been a police officer, but she never knew the real reason why he stopped. 3 years ago, when David's wife passed away from cancer, he found himself alone and looking for a new purpose. His daughter was grown and married, living her own life in another state. David could have retired quietly, could have found a peaceful job in a quiet town. Instead, he answered a classified ad for a janitor position at the Central City Police Department. Maybe it was crazy to go back to the world that had hurt him so badly. Maybe it was asking for trouble. But David felt like he still had work to do. He couldn't carry a badge anymore, but he could still serve justice in his own way. If there was corruption in this department like there had been in Detroit, maybe he could do something about it this time. The first year on the job was like learning to be invisible all over again. David listened to conversations while he cleaned. He watched how the officers interacted with each other. He paid attention to which cases got priority and which ones seemed to disappear into filing cabinets. Most of what he observed was normal police work done by good people trying to do a difficult job. But there were small things that bothered him. Jokes that went too far. Evidence that seemed to go missing at convenient times. Money that appeared in places where it shouldn't be. David was patient. He had learned patience during his years away from police work. He cleaned floors and emptied trash cans and waited for the right moment to act. He knew that if he was going to expose corruption this time, he would need to be smarter about it. He would need proof that couldn't be ignored or explained away. The other janitors who worked the day shift sometimes asked David why he was so quiet. They wondered why he never joined them for lunch or complained about the officers who left messes in their offices. David just smiled and said he preferred to keep to himself. What they didn't know was that he was always working, always watching, always waiting for the moment when his real job would begin. That moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. It was a Thursday night in November when David heard the conversation that would change everything. He was working late, cleaning the conference room on the second floor where the detectives held their meetings. The room smelled like stale coffee and the kind of stress that comes from dealing with too many unsolved cases. David was wiping down the long table when he heard voices in the hallway. This wasn't unusual. Officers often worked late, and David had grown used to the sound of their conversations drifting through the building. But something about these voices made him pause. They were speaking quietly, almost whispering, which was strange for cops who usually talked loud enough to be heard over sirens and radio chatter. He continued cleaning, moving slowly and quietly as he always did. The voices got closer and David recognized them. Detective Williams, who had been on the force for 15 years and drove a car that cost more than David made in 2 years. Sergeant Rodriguez, who everyone respected, but who seemed to have expensive taste for someone on a police salary. And Officer Bennett, who was younger than the others but seemed to have more money than he should. They entered the conference room, not noticing David in the corner where he was emptying the trash can. David kept his head down and continued his work, moving like a ghost among the furniture. In his 3 years here, he had perfected the art of being invisible. People talked around him like he wasn't even there. The 3 officers sat down at the table, and Williams pulled out a folder. David could see it was thick with papers and photographs. Williams looked around the room, his eyes passing right over David without really seeing him. "We have a problem," Williams said in a low voice. "That community activist, the one who's been organizing protests, he's getting too close to the truth." David's hands froze on the trash can, but he forced himself to keep moving. His years as a detective had taught him how to listen without appearing to listen, how to gather information while seeming to do something else entirely. Rodriguez leaned forward. "How close are we talking about?" "Close enough that he's asking the right questions about the Morrison case," Williams replied. "If he keeps digging, he's going to find out what really happened that night." David remembered the Morrison case. It had been in the news 6 months ago. A young man named Tony Morrison had been arrested for drug possession during a traffic stop. The case had seemed straightforward until Morrison died in custody, supposedly from a heart attack. The family had demanded an investigation, but the case had been closed quickly. The official report said Morrison had a pre-existing heart condition. Bennett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Maybe we should just let this one go. Morrison's already dead. His family got some money from the city. Why rock the boat?" Williams laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Because the boat is worth too much money to let it sink now. Do you know how much we've made from our arrangement with the dealers on the south side? Do you want to give up your new house? Your kid's private school?" David kept cleaning, but his mind was racing. These officers were taking money from drug dealers. They had covered up Tony Morrison's death, and now they were planning to do something to silence the activist who was asking questions. Rodriguez pulled out a small plastic bag from his jacket. Even from across the room, David could see it contained white powder. "Plant this in his car during the next protest. Make sure there's enough to justify a serious charge. Once he's in the system, his credibility is shot. Nobody listens to convicted drug dealers. What if he has an alibi?" Bennett asked. "What if he can prove he wasn't near his car when the drugs were planted?" Williams smiled coldly. "That's what police testimony is for. 3 officers saw him acting suspiciously near his vehicle. 3 officers searched the car and found the drugs. Who's a judge going to believe? 3 decorated police officers or some troublemaker with a criminal record? David felt sick to his stomach. This was exactly what had happened in Detroit. Good people being framed by corrupt cops who thought they were above the law. The only difference was that this time, David was in a position to do something about it, but he had to be careful. If these officers discovered that he had overheard their conversation, David knew what would happen. They would find a way to silence him, just like they had silenced Toni Morrison, just like they were planning to silence the activist. Bennett looked worried. What if something goes wrong? What if the activist gets hurt during the arrest? Williams shrugged. Sometimes people resist arrest. Sometimes they get injured while resisting. That's just part of the job. The callousness in Williams' voice made David's blood run cold. These weren't just corrupt cops taking bribes. These were dangerous people who were willing to hurt or kill anyone who got in their way. Rodriguez noticed David for the first time and nudged Williams. Should we be talking about this with him here? Williams looked over at David, who was now wiping down the windows on the far side of the room. Williams laughed. Him? Don't worry about the janitor. Guy barely speaks English. Probably can't even read, let alone understand what we're talking about. The 3 officers continued their conversation for another 20 minutes, discussing details about when and where they would plant the drugs, how they would coordinate their stories, and what they would do if anyone started asking questions. David listened to every word while pretending to focus on his cleaning. When the officers finally left, David waited another 10 minutes before he moved. His hands were shaking as he finished cleaning the conference room. Everything these officers had said was exactly the kind of corruption he had witnessed in Detroit. The difference was that this time he had heard it firsthand. This time, he had a chance to stop it before an innocent person got hurt. But David also knew that 3 years of working as a janitor hadn't erased the lessons he had learned as a detective. He couldn't just walk into the police chief's office and report what he had heard. The chief might be involved in the corruption. Even if he wasn't, it would be David's word against 3 respected officers. Without proof, David would be the one who ended up looking like a troublemaker. David needed evidence. Real evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. He needed to document everything these officers were doing. Build a case against them that was so strong that even their friends in the department couldn't protect them. As David pushed his cleaning cart down the empty hallway, he was already making plans. His years as a detective had taught him how to investigate crimes. His years as a janitor had taught him how to be invisible. Now it was time to combine those skills and do what he should have done 20 years ago in Detroit. The hunt for justice was about to begin, and this time David wasn't going to back down. The next morning, David started his investigation. But this time he wasn't working with a team of detectives or sophisticated police equipment. He was working alone, with nothing but his cleaning supplies and 20 years of investigative experience. David's first stop was an electronics store across town, far from the police station where someone might recognize him. He bought a small digital recorder, the kind that could fit in his shirt pocket and record for hours without being noticed. He also bought a tiny camera that looked like a pen and a prepaid cell phone that couldn't be traced back to him. When David returned to work that evening, he had a new purpose. He still mopped floors and emptied trash cans, but now he was also documenting everything he saw and heard. The digital recorder went in his shirt pocket, hidden under his janitor's badge. The camera pen stayed clipped to his pocket, ready to photograph any documents or evidence he might find. The first week of his investigation didn't produce much. David recorded normal conversations about cases and police work. He photographed routine paperwork and incident reports, but he was patient. Good investigations took time, and David had learned to wait for the right opportunities. His breakthrough came on a Tuesday night when he was cleaning Williams' office. The detective had left his computer on, and the screen showed an email that made David's heart race. It was a message from someone called Southside Sam with a simple message. Package delivered. Payment due Friday as usual. David quickly photographed the email with his pen camera, then continued cleaning as if nothing had happened, but his mind was working fast. The email confirmed that Williams was receiving payments from someone on the south side of the city, exactly where the detective had mentioned drug dealers during the conference room conversation. Over the next few weeks, David began to piece together the full scope of the corruption. He discovered that Williams, Rodriguez, and Bennett weren't the only officers involved. There were at least 6 cops taking money from drug dealers in exchange for protection. They were tipping off dealers about upcoming raids, destroying evidence when it was convenient, and intimidating witnesses who might testify against their criminal partners. David found financial records in Rodriguez's desk that showed bank deposits much larger than a police sergeant's salary could explain. He photographed text messages on Bennett's phone that contained coded language about deliveries and packages. He recorded conversations where the corrupt officers discussed which judges were friendly to their cause and which prosecutors could be trusted to look the other way. But the most disturbing discovery came when David was cleaning the evidence room late one night. He found a box labeled with Tony Morrison's name, the young man who had died in police custody. According to the official reports, Morrison had been arrested for drug possession, but when David looked inside the evidence box, he found something that made his blood run cold. There were 2 bags of drugs in the box. One was labeled as the evidence that had been found during Morrison's arrest. But the second bag was labeled differently, with a date that was 3 days after Morrison's death. David realized that the police had planted additional drugs in the evidence room to make Morrison's case look stronger. They were covering up their crime even after the victim was dead. David photographed everything in the evidence box, making sure to capture the labels and dates clearly. This was the smoking gun he needed. This was proof that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as a misunderstanding. As David's investigation continued, he began to understand the full extent of what was happening. The corrupt officers weren't just taking small bribes. They were partners in a drug operation that was flooding the south side of the city with illegal substances. They were protecting dealers who were destroying lives and communities. And they were willing to kill anyone who got in their way. David also learned more about the activist the officers were planning to frame. His name was Robert Washington, and he was a former teacher who had started organizing community protests after his own nephew died from a drug overdose. Washington had been asking questions about police response times in his neighborhood, wondering why it took so long for officers to respond to drug-related crimes. He had been demanding meetings with city officials, requesting investigations into police procedures, and organizing marches to bring attention to the problem. What Washington didn't know was that his questions were getting too close to the truth. The corrupt officers were deliberately slow to respond to drug crimes because they were being paid to protect the dealers. They couldn't arrest their criminal partners without losing their source of income. David knew he had to warn Washington about the plan to frame him, but he also knew he had to be careful. If the activist suddenly changed his behavior or stopped asking questions, the corrupt officers might realize that someone had leaked their plans. David needed to find a way to protect Washington while still gathering enough evidence to bring down the entire operation. The solution came to David one night while he was cleaning the parking garage. He noticed that Washington's car was parked in the same spot every day when he came to the police station to file complaints or request meetings. David realized he could leave an anonymous note on Washington's windshield, warning him about the planned frame-up without revealing his own identity. The note was simple. They plan to plant drugs in your car during the next protest. Be careful who you trust, a friend who wants justice. David watched from the shadows as Washington found the note the next morning. He saw the activist read it several times, look around the parking garage suspiciously, then carefully fold the paper and put it in his pocket. Washington's behavior didn't change dramatically, but David noticed that he started checking his car more carefully and bringing friends with him to protest to serve as witnesses. Meanwhile, David continued building his case. He had recorded hours of conversations, photographed dozens of documents, and documented a pattern of corruption that went back several years. But he knew that having evidence and being able to use it were 2 different things. David's experience in Detroit had taught him that corrupt police officers often had friends in high places, prosecutors who owed them favors, judges who looked the other way, internal affairs investigators who buried complaints. If David was going to expose this corruption, he needed to be absolutely sure that his evidence would reach someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. David spent his days off researching the FBI office in the city, trying to identify agents who specialized in police corruption cases. He looked up federal prosecutors who had successfully prosecuted dirty cops in other cities. He even researched journalists who had exposed police scandals in other states. But David also knew that his time was running out. The corrupt officers were getting suspicious about the anonymous note Washington had received. They were starting to wonder if someone inside the department was leaking information. Williams had even suggested bringing in internal affairs to investigate possible security breaches. During one of his late-night cleaning sessions, David overheard Rodriguez and Bennett discussing their concerns. "Someone warned that activist," Rodriguez said. "There's no way he could have known about our plan unless someone told him." Bennett nodded. "Maybe we should postpone the operation. Wait until things cool down." But Williams disagreed. "We can't afford to wait. Washington is getting more people involved every week. His protests are getting bigger. The media is starting to pay attention. We need to shut him down now before this gets out of hand." David realized that the corrupt officers were planning to move ahead with framing Washington, despite their suspicions about a leak. This meant David was running out of time. He needed to finish his investigation and get his evidence to the right people before an innocent man was arrested and possibly hurt. The next phase of David's plan would be the most dangerous. He was about to stop being invisible and step back into the light. After 3 years of hiding in the shadows, it was time for Detective David Chen to return to active duty. David knew that timing was everything. For weeks he had been watching the schedules and routines of everyone in the police station. He knew that Internal Affairs Commander Patricia Holmes arrived at work every Tuesday at exactly 8:15 in the morning. He knew that she always spent the first hour of her day reviewing cases in her office, usually without interruption. More importantly, David had done his research on Commander Holmes. She had transferred to Central City from the state capital 2 years ago, specifically to clean up departments with corruption problems. She had a reputation for being tough, honest, and immune to the kind of political pressure that often protected dirty cops. If anyone in the building could be trusted with David's evidence, it was her. On the Monday night before his planned meeting, David made his final preparations. He organized all of his evidence into a thick manila folder: photographs of documents, transcripts of recorded conversations, financial records, and a detailed timeline showing how the corruption operation worked. He also wrote a letter explaining his background as a former detective and his reasons for conducting the investigation. David barely slept that night. For 3 years he had been invisible, safe in his anonymity. Tomorrow he would step out of the shadows and risk everything he had built. If Commander Holmes turned out to be part of the corruption, or if she couldn't protect him from retaliation, David knew his life would be in danger. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold. David put on his janitor uniform one last time, clipped his identification badge to his shirt, and drove to the police station. But instead of entering through the side door as he had done for 3 years, David walked through the front entrance where visitors and complainants normally came. The desk sergeant, Officer Murphy, looked up in surprise when he saw David approaching. Murphy had seen David around the building countless times, but always in the context of cleaning supplies and maintenance work. Seeing the janitor in the public area of the station seemed strange and out of place. "David, what are you doing here?" Murphy asked. "Did something happen with your cleaning schedule?" David took a deep breath. This was the point of no return. "I need to speak with Commander Holmes in Internal Affairs. I have information about police misconduct that she needs to see." Murphy stared at David for a long moment, then burst into laughter. "You want to report police misconduct? What happened? Did someone leave too big a mess in the break room?" The laughter drew the attention of other officers in the lobby. Detective Williams, who happened to be signing in for his shift, walked over to see what was so funny. "What's going on here?" Williams asked. Murphy was still chuckling. "The janitor here thinks he has information about police misconduct. He wants to talk to Internal Affairs." Williams looked at David with amusement and something else that might have been suspicion. "Is that right? What kind of misconduct are we talking about, David? Someone forget to say please when they asked you to clean up a spill?" More officers began to gather around, attracted by the unusual scene of the quiet janitor making demands in the public lobby. David recognized most of them. Some were good cops who had no idea about the corruption in their department. Others were part of the network that Williams had built. Rodriguez appeared from the elevator, took one look at the crowd, and joined the group. "What's all this about?" Our janitor here thinks he's found some police misconduct, Williams explained. He wants to report us to internal affairs. The officers burst into laughter. David had expected this reaction, but it still stung. For 3 years, these people had treated him like he was invisible. Now they were treating him like he was a joke. Come on, David, Rodriguez said in a condescending tone. If you have a problem with how we're doing our jobs, you can talk to any of us. We're all friends here, right? No need to get internal affairs involved over some misunderstanding. David clutched his manila folder tighter. I need to speak with Commander Holmes. This is a serious matter. Bennett had arrived during the commotion and was watching David with barely concealed hostility. Serious matter, like what? Did you find some parking tickets in someone's trash can and think it was evidence of corruption? The laughter got louder. David could feel his face burning with embarrassment, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had faced worse than this in Detroit. He had been threatened, intimidated, and ultimately forced to leave his career. A little laughter wasn't going to stop him now. Murphy finally stopped laughing long enough to pick up his phone. Let me call Commander Holmes and tell her that our janitor wants to report police misconduct. I'm sure she'll get a kick out of this. While Murphy made the call, the group of officers continued to make jokes at David's expense. Williams was the loudest, suggesting that maybe David had been watching too many police shows on television and thought he was a detective now. Rodriguez wondered if David even understood what police misconduct meant. Bennett suggested that maybe David was having mental health issues and needed to see a counselor instead of internal affairs. Through it all, David stood quietly, holding his evidence and waiting for permission to see Commander Holmes. He thought about Tony Morrison, the young man who had died in custody while these officers covered up their crimes. He thought about Robert Washington, the activist who was still in danger of being framed. He thought about all the people in the community whose lives had been destroyed by the drugs that these corrupt officers were helping to distribute. The laughter and jokes continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then Murphy hung up his phone and looked at David with a mixture of amusement and pity. Commander Holmes says she'll see you, Murphy announced. But David, I think you should reconsider this. You're going to embarrass yourself up there. These are serious people dealing with serious crimes. They don't have time for whatever conspiracy theories you've cooked up. Williams stepped closer to David, his expression more serious now. Murphy's right, David. Why don't you just go back to your cleaning and forget about this? Sometimes people think they see things that aren't really there. Sometimes people misunderstand conversations they overhear. It's easy to make mistakes when you don't understand how police work really operates. There was a threat hidden in Williams' words, and David recognized it. The detective was trying to give him one last chance to back down, to return to his invisible existence and pretend he had never heard anything. It was the same kind of threat David had received 20 years ago in Detroit, but this time David didn't back down. I appreciate your concern, David said quietly, but I need to speak with Commander Holmes. This is important. The officers exchanged glances. The joking atmosphere had become more tense. Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice harder now. David, you've been working here for 3 years. We've all been good to you, haven't we? We've never given you any trouble. We've always treated you with respect. Why would you want to cause problems now? David looked around at the faces surrounding him. Some showed genuine confusion. Others showed anger. A few showed fear, though they were trying to hide it. I'm not trying to cause problems, David said. I'm trying to prevent them. Murphy pointed toward the elevator. Commander Holmes is on the 3rd floor. Room 312. But David, when this turns out to be nothing, when you realize you've made a mistake, remember that these officers tried to save you from embarrassing yourself. David nodded and walked toward the elevator. Behind him, he could hear the officers talking in low voices. Some were still making jokes, but others sounded worried. Williams was telling the group that they should get back to work, that there was nothing to be concerned about. As the elevator doors closed, David caught one last glimpse of the lobby. The officers were dispersing, but several of them were watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. David realized that his 3 years of invisibility were over. After today, everyone in the building would know exactly who he was. The elevator climbed slowly toward the 3rd floor, carrying David toward a meeting that would change everything. In his hands, he held enough evidence to destroy the careers of 6 corrupt officers and expose a drug operation that had been poisoning his community for years. The only question now was whether Commander Holmes would believe him, and whether she would be strong enough to act on what he was about to tell her. Commander Patricia Holmes was reviewing a case file when David knocked on her office door. She looked up to see a man in a janitor's uniform holding a thick manila folder, and her first thought was that there must be some kind of maintenance issue that needed her attention. "Come in," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Officer Murphy said you wanted to report police misconduct. I have to say that's not something I hear very often from maintenance staff." David sat down and placed the folder on his lap. He had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but now that he was here, he felt the weight of everything he was about to set in motion. "Commander Holmes, my name is David Chen. For the past 3 years, I've worked as a night janitor in this building. But before that, I was Detective David Chen with the Detroit Police Department for 8 years. Holmes raised an eyebrow. This wasn't what she had been expecting. "You're a former police officer?" "Yes, ma'am. I left the force 20 years ago under difficult circumstances. I came here to work as a janitor because I needed a job, but also because I wanted to stay close to law enforcement. What I discovered over the past few months is that this department has a serious corruption problem." David opened his folder and began laying documents on Holmes's desk. 6 officers in this department are taking money from drug dealers on the south side of the city. They're providing protection for drug operations, destroying evidence, intimidating witnesses, and covering up crimes. I have recordings, photographs, and financial evidence that proves everything I'm telling you. Holmes leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious as she looked at the evidence spread across her desk. "These are some very serious accusations, Mr. Chen. Walk me through what you have here." For the next hour, David methodically explained his investigation. He played recordings of Williams, Rodriguez, and Bennett planning to frame Robert Washington. He showed photographs of the planted evidence in Toni Morrison's case. He presented financial records that showed unexplained deposits in the corrupt officers' bank accounts. Holmes listened without interruption, taking notes and asking occasional questions. As a veteran investigator herself, she could recognize solid police work when she saw it. What David had assembled wasn't the confused ramblings of a disgruntled employee. This was a professional investigation conducted by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "Mr. Chen," Holmes said when David finished his presentation, "why didn't you bring this to my attention sooner? Some of these recordings are from several weeks ago." David had expected this question. "Because I needed to be absolutely certain. 20 years ago in Detroit, I tried to expose corruption in my own department. I didn't have enough evidence, and the corrupt officers had too many friends in high places. My family was threatened, and I was forced to leave the force. I couldn't let that happen again." Holmes nodded slowly. "And you're sure about the timeline? You believe these officers are planning to frame Mr. Washington this week?" "Yes, ma'am. Based on the conversations I've recorded, they're planning to plant drugs in his car during the protest scheduled for Friday. Williams is getting nervous about Washington's activism. He wants to discredit him before the community rally gets any bigger." Holmes reached for her phone. "I'm calling the FBI. This level of corruption requires federal intervention. Local prosecutors might have relationships with these officers that could compromise the investigation." While Holmes made her calls, David sat back in his chair and felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that he had finally done what he should have done 20 years ago. Anxiety about what would happen next. He knew that exposing corruption was dangerous business, and that the next few days would determine whether justice would prevail or whether the corrupt officers would find a way to protect themselves. Within 2 hours, FBI agents had arrived at the police station. Special Agent Lisa Kim, who specialized in police corruption cases, interviewed David for 3 hours, going over every piece of evidence in detail. She was impressed by the quality of David's investigation and the strength of his evidence. "Mr. Chen, this is some of the best documentation of police corruption I've seen in 15 years with the Bureau," Agent Kim told him. "You've essentially done our job for us. With this evidence, we can move forward immediately." The FBI moved quickly. By Thursday morning, federal agents had obtained warrants to search the homes and financial records of all 6 corrupt officers. They had also set up surveillance to monitor the planned framing of Robert Washington. Hoping to catch the officers in the act of planting evidence, David continued to work his normal schedule, but everything had changed. Word had spread through the police station that the FBI was conducting an investigation. Though most officers didn't know the details, the corrupt officers were clearly nervous. holding whispered conversations and looking over their shoulders constantly. On Friday, the day of the planned frame-up, David watched from his cleaning cart as Williams, Rodriguez, and Bennett prepared for their operation. They had no idea that FBI agents were watching their every move, or that their intended victim had been warned and was taking precautions. The community rally that day was larger than usual, with nearly 200 people gathering to protest police response times in their neighborhood. Robert Washington spoke passionately about the need for accountability and transparency in law enforcement, unaware that he was walking into a trap that had been carefully prepared for him. David watched from a window in the police station as the events unfolded in the parking lot across the street. He saw Williams approach Washington's car with a small package. He saw Rodriguez and Bennett positioning themselves to serve as witnesses, and he saw FBI agents emerge from unmarked vehicles to make arrests just as Williams was about to plant the drugs. The arrests happened so quickly that most of the protesters didn't realize what was occurring. Williams, Rodriguez, and Bennett were handcuffed and read their rights while dozens of FBI agents swarmed the area. Within minutes, the three corrupt officers were in federal custody, along with the planted drugs that would have destroyed an innocent man's life. Over the next week, the other three officers involved in the corruption ring were also arrested. The FBI raids on their homes uncovered evidence of drug money, communications with dealers, and proof of the broader conspiracy that David had been documenting for months. The arrests made front-page news in the local newspaper and led the evening broadcasts on every television station in the city. The story of police corruption and the federal investigation dominated the headlines for weeks. But what captured the public's imagination most was the revelation that the investigation had been conducted by a janitor who was actually a former detective. When David's role in the investigation became public, the reaction in the police station was dramatic. Officers who had laughed at him just days before now looked at him with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. Some approached him to apologize for the way they had treated him. Others seemed angry that he had been watching and listening to them for 3 years without revealing his true identity. Commander Holmes called David into her office for a private meeting the week after the arrests. "Mr. Chen, I want you to know that the FBI is calling your investigation one of the most thorough and professional they've ever seen from a civilian. You've likely prevented multiple crimes and saved at least one innocent person from being framed." David nodded. "I just did what needed to be done. What I should have done 20 years ago." Holmes leaned back in her chair. "I've been authorized to offer you a position as an investigator with internal affairs. Your experience and skills could be valuable in preventing this kind of corruption from happening again."